Hello, everyone. I'm Jordan Jones, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations about the study of the Bible, its lands, civilizations, and archaeology. And today, I'm very happy to welcome Peter Miller, Dr. Peter Miller, the visiting assistant professor of biblical studies here at the University of Iowa. And among Peter's many skills is an interest in angels and demons, which is very handy for us here in the month of October because it's unavoidable. Demons are everywhere. It's October. It's time for the possessions and the hauntings to take flight. So, Peter, thank you for taking the time today to come in and clarify some of the history around demons.
Well, thanks for having me. As you mentioned, this is a topic of particular interest to me. In fact, my master's thesis was specifically on demon combat in early Christianity. So it's a topic that's long fascinated me, and any excuse I get to talk about it is always welcome.
Well, what brought you? I mean, demons feels like an interesting place to spend your time being focused, and it got you at an early point. So how did the demons get you, Peter, so young?
So part of my interest was just this odd sensation, this kind of tension when you look at something like the Bible, or you look at early Christian texts and these debates, where you got these things that feel like they're opposed to God. Mm-hmm. You've got these, it feels like this enemy army invading the world. And you're just like, why are they even here? Like, where do they come from? What do they do? Why does a God let them exist in these texts? And watching the different ways people rationalize the existence of these antagonistic, invisible things. Not always invisible. Some of my early monks really like these stories about being attacked by demons that just take on the shapes of animals and assault them at night.
Yeah.
But just the existence of demons in general and the tension it raises with questions about like the goodness, the mercy of God, and how they can fit into this larger picture. As someone who's also interested in things like creative writing and world building, these questions about like how to make sense of these existing, given what else we know about the Bible's view on what God does in that world, just kept picking at my brain.
Well, let's start with a groundwork question then, because I think already you've introduced some of the things that are some of the base problems of people listening will be in different positions where they identify or frame or define demons. So could you set a groundwork definition for us for today, how you would define demons, their identity, and kind of we can fall into where do they come from within that?
Yeah. So let's start with like the modern view of the demons, because I think to get at how we get to a modern sense of demons, we have to talk about like 2 or 3 different cultural backgrounds that build and mold and shape each other into this. So like, I think when we think of a modern demon, what we're imagining is a usually invisible spirit or supernatural thing that is opposed to God, or at least opposed to goodness.
Right.
And so thus manifests by attacking people.
Yeah.
Whether that is tempting them, possessing them, literally just causing them to become sick. And these things like can be visible. They have an aversion to holy things, but they're these hard to pin down, slippery things. So when we talk about them, say in my Angels and Demons class, we'll typically talk about them as these antagonistic supernatural entities, and we'll kind of leave it open.
Okay.
But part of the challenge of studying demons in the context of the Bible in particular is that there is no clear singular word in either Greek or Hebrew that cleanly matches on to what we as contemporary English speakers would call a demon.
Interesting. So then if there is no one set word, is it just choose your own adventure? And I like this one, I'm going to call it, I like or I dislike, and that's how we're going between the two? Or are there some places where people are more comfortable saying in this space, is it by name or by action that they start to get identified?
So it's a weird mixture. There are, let's start in Hebrew. Let's start with the Hebrew Bible. there are a couple what I flag as watchwords that become stand-ins for what kinds of demons can be. The word that in later rabbinic Hebrew will become the default for a demon is shed, or plural shadim. This word appears I believe, twice in the Hebrew Bible, always as the object to which things are being sacrificed that isn't God. So this word that will become the common Hebraic word for demons is just almost more like an idol in some ways. The more common word for this kind of not quite human, not quite natural thing is the seir, seirim, plural. And this will often get translated as sometimes satyr and sometimes goat demon. And these seirim do show up in a couple places. Isaiah 34 is probably the most famous place where we get this list of these animals, often like birds of prey or carrion birds, attacking and haunting these ruins of this kingdom that the prophet is denouncing an oracle for. And in this, we get the seirim, these goat demons that appear. And this is really where we see the seirim and perhaps tying in concerns about scapegoats like Azazel. This association of goats, of wandering scavenger things out in the desert. And so a lot of early language around these evil spirits, whatever term we're giving them, and we'll talk about evil spirits here in a second, I imagine, but they tend to be associated with either ruins or wilderness. So rather than cleanly good or evil, it feels more like demons are, when we're talking about the seirim, concerns about the like chaos and untamed wild as opposed to the places of civilization. And it's in the transgression of that boundary demons become a threat.
So in the Hebrew Bible, less directly connected with that human antagonism, more in that central space or undefined space. What about when we move to the New Testament? Because I think people probably are thinking, if I'm thinking of demons in the Bible, I'm going to the Gospels. And we've got some demon possession, which is then feeling very different than this.
But you better not be going to John, because there's no demon possession in John.
No demons in John.
We just got to stick with the synoptics.
Which is why John is the best gospel. But there's no demons in John. What about the synoptics, though? How do they frame demons?
So what's interesting about the synoptics is they seem to be picking up this trend in Second Temple Judaism where demons are becoming more personalized. We see explicit possessions. We see explicit maladies being brought about by demons, with people with a paralyzed hand, people who are driven insane, who lose their personality. For me, the go-to example is Legion in Mark. This man around Gerasenes who has been afflicted with so many demons that they refer to themselves as Legion, purposefully invoking a Roman military term here, right?
Very handy.
Hence the invading army feeling, right? But these demons are interesting because they recognize the authority of Jesus instantly. They invoke God. They say, we adjure you by God not to assault us. And so, number one, the demons are talking. That's a thing that the Seirim don't really do.
A major difference between one. And part of those things where the New Testament examples start to feel a lot more like what we associate when we're thinking of movies, for example. Some of the things you're talking about with the maladies, the illnesses, the talking, have moved a lot closer to where we're comfortable. But in this transition, what would you say is maybe one of the things that leads to such a significant change in identity?
So I think we have to talk about evil spirits and the question of if God is responsible for sicking demons on people here.
Yes. Well, so then maybe to get there, let's backtrack a little bit in the question of, naturally this comes around to where do demons come from, I think, in this connection with God and creation. And are the demons fallen angels? Are the demons the servants of Satan? How would you answer those types of questions? Where do they come from? What's their relationship?
So answering that, there are some really interesting questions. One of the probably most famous apocryphal works of all time is First Enoch. And in First Enoch, we're really grappling with what is going on in Genesis 6. And Genesis 6 is this description that there are these sons of God, these B'nai Elohim, who look down and see the beauty of human women. And so these entities, who will come to be called the Watchers, they transgress the boundary, entering the human world, and they sire children. They create these angel-human hybrids, which the text of Genesis 6 calls the Nephilim.
Yeah.
But when translated into the Greek Septuagint, the Greek word chosen is going to be gigantes. And so we get the story of these giants being born. And this may play into giants inhabiting Canaan when Joshua sends the spies out. And
we get some of those traditions of, these are the sons of. And although they're supposed to have maybe died in the flood, and how are they still around? But we still get some of this people is the descendants of.
And the Genesis 6 account, as you say, is right before the flood narrative.
Yeah.
It causes the land itself to cry out against the abominations, the consumption, the destruction that these Nephilim are causing. And so the flood happens, they go away, except for maybe some who are sticking around in Canaan for later. But broadly,
the ones that are too tall to die by the waters.
Yeah. So broadly, they are still around, but only as spirits. And so in a lot of Second Temple literature, what we see is the explanation that demons are the spirits of the dead giants.
Oh, okay.
And so when we look to, say, the Book of Jubilees, we get a recognition that God looks and sees these spirits and wants to destroy them all. And he is persuaded by an angel named Mastema to only destroy 9/10 of them, but to reserve a 10th and to keep them bound. And Mastema now will have the authority, with God's permission, to release them as part of God's punishment on people. And this looks a whole lot like the opening chapters of Job for people interested in the question of how Satan fits into this picture. And so Mastema looks a lot like this Satan figure. And there's a lot of discussion about to what extent Satan as a character versus a category of angel fits into this. We may be familiar with discussions around Satan being a role, the adversary, the accuser.
In Job as that adversarial character rather than Satan as this fully fleshed out individual that we may be more familiar with thinking of.
Yeah, in Job, we see him as part of this divine court.
Yeah.
And his job is to convince God that people are wicked. And so we get this story in which Job has everything taken away from him to see if he will denounce God now that he hasn't gotten everything he wants. But it's God who takes it away.
Right.
Satan just convinces God to test Job.
Just the one poking.
Yeah, just technically two. One to kill off his family and take all his possessions, and then once more to take away his health. But just a couple little prods, and God inflicts the punishment. And I think it's in that question of that discomfort with God causing unjust punishment. Where do these seemingly random events come from? Is it a God who is willing to test us? Or is it these wild creatures that are assailing us? There's a lot of concern with explaining apparently chance happenings.
Yeah.
And it's in this, coupled with the notion of God's justice, that we see demons starting to fill a role. It's a way to move agency for seemingly evil acts.
They're solving a problem.
God. Yes, they're solving a problem of, it feels kind of bad if God just decides he's going to take everything away from Job, but it's fine because he's God. Like, people have long grappled with this passage in the ancient world and in the modern. And I think we see in something like Jubilees with Mystema and the binding of angels, or the binding of demons to an angel specifically, that we see an explanation for how God can be sovereign over everything, but evil can still exist in the world. And it's in that backdrop, God has permitted demons to exist, that we really see the New Testament flourishing and engaging with the idea of the present world is one that is the dominion of Satan. It has been given over to demons, but there are agents who, with the right names, with the right rituals, can combat them. And obviously, for the Christian Gospels, the exorcist par excellence is Jesus himself.
So they're a problem, but they're something that you can handle through the right means of power within that tradition. What about demons aren't confined to just the biblical text or the Christian tradition? So how would you compare some of that framework with other literature and how other civilizations' histories are dealing with the ideas of demons? Are they very similar, or do they have significant differences in how they're framing these types of things?
So, especially if we look to other ancient Mediterranean cultures, there is a lot of interesting overlap. And I think the interesting place to go here for similarity is a set of cuneiform tablets called the Udug texts. And these are preserved in Akkadian, so although we're using the Sumerian Udug here, the Akkadian text as presented, we'll call them Utuku. They're the same thing, same word, just being rendered a little bit differently. But these are both magical and medical texts for the diagnosis of maladies for which the resolution is an exorcism in the name of the god Marduk. And so Marduk becomes the god who is kind of overlaid with the practicing exorcist, who must identify a kind of demon or some subset category, issues a litany of potential types of demon that this malady might be caused by, has a variety of implements like a bell, a special branch, some herbs, and will present them, using them ritually to help drive the demon away. Some of our related texts around the Udug will frame the separation of these evil spirits or evil gods from a sick man. They will frame them as divorcing the spirit from the person who is ill. And so there is an attempt to separate this external force that is causing problems for the person. And I think really there's a lot of similarity here to the New Testament concern. But I think if there's an interesting connection between them, some tissue there, the story of King Saul is really instructive here.
Yes. Well, let's go straight into then I think a great example to jump onto that most people probably wouldn't say if I'm looking to ideas of possession in the Bible. The story of King Saul likely isn't the one that's at the top of the list. And so for framing, right, this is when Saul is king over Israel and Saul starts to do some things that Saul shouldn't be doing as a part of this losing of the divine favor. Is this a possession moment? Why would you say this is? Because we have that removal of favor. And what is in this, and some of that ambiguity you talked about earlier, that marks this potentially as a moment of demon possession?
Yeah. So what's going on here is in the moment after Samuel anoints David to show that he will be the next king, we immediately move to Saul and a story that he has lost God's favor. And God sends an evil spirit to Saul and it torments him. And so while we don't see either of those Hebrew watchwords, this isn't a Seirim, this is an evil spirit. It's a ruach, some kind of spirit,
more generic term.
Generic term of spirit, breath, but God sends it to Saul. And it causes Saul to enter these kinds of fits. We see a change in personality. He is agitated. He is angry. He is losing himself in this. We see maybe echoes of what we'll see in Daniel with King Nebuchadnezzar's madness, right? There's this interesting transgression of expected psychology for what we've seen King Saul do. And the solution here that is found is David is brought to Saul to play music to soothe him. And so this soothes the spirit. And we see a kind of, let's call it a flare up of this incident again 2 chapters later when Saul tries to throw a spear at David. And so what we see is this interesting case where a spiritual enemy has been sent to antagonize a person, justly or accidentally. This text seems to think it is God sent, and thus it is part of this broader divine plan.
It frames it as a part of the correct response to Saul's actions.
Yes, God's taken away the favor and sent in its place this evil spirit to torment Saul. And don't you know who's the only one who can help? It's David.
Very handy.
Who now is conveniently going to be in the palace that he knows he's supposed to inherit.
And this, growing up, the approach that I was always taught to this story is like some of the other David narratives where it's David is always around things that are going wrong, but it's never David's fault. And that this is just one of those moments where, David is just being the good guy and helping Saul. But I was never told this as demon possession of Saul, which is something that, as you return to this later, you go, oh yeah, this does really sound like, but it was just, it's tormenting or it's pushing or it's a punishment, but it's not demon possession because we don't get largely demon possession in the Hebrew Bible. That's a New Testament thing. So this isn't a demon. But framing it as a demon does make a lot of sense, especially like you've laid out, connecting it with some of those. How do the Marduk texts talk about what can you use to send the demons away? This isn't maybe David coming in Jesus style and casting the demon out, but how can we be soothing this demon brings a different perspective to this. In that transition then between those types of literatures, are there other stories you think fit in similarly to that transitional from kind of in that Saul demon possession before we get all the way to the New Testament type of demon possession that fill out how the ancient world is thinking of possession, if they have some similar ideas of what demons are or can be doing, other stories of how possession fit in that people should be aware of?
Yeah. Let's talk about one Greek example, and then I want to talk about Tobit.
Okay, yes. We got to get to Tobit.
We get to Tobit, but I want to talk a little bit about the Greek world here briefly, because it's from the Greek word daimon that we get the English word demon.
Yeah.
And despite the expectation that this would be a very similar thing, the Greek daimon looks very different than the kinds of evil spiritual agents that we expect. And I think this is exemplified most in the case of Plato's treatment of the daimon. Sometimes used in the diminutive daimonion, little thing. In the Greek world, a daimon is kind of a more generic term for some kind of lesser divinity. It's not a full god, but it is some kind of divine agent. And so in Plato's texts, we see that Socrates has a personal daimon. And so while if you want to be very nitpicky, we could talk about Socrates being possessed from birth if we want to make this claim.
Is why some of Socrates is so hard to get through. Is that what you're telling us, that if you're having a hard time reading your Socrates, it's because maybe Socrates was possessed?
Well, interestingly, the way this possession manifests is by convincing him not to get into politics, which, I mean, is a lesson that I think we could all take a bit from here. But this demon, this daimon with Socrates from birth, only manifests, as far as he tells us in the Apology, as a voice that only he can hear. And what happens is, as he's considering what to do, the voice tells him whether or not to do it, if it's going to be virtuous, if it's going to be good for him, if it's going to be ethical. And it's this voice that convinces him, don't go into politics. Don't do that. That's going to be bad for you. Go into philosophy. This will be good for you. And this personal daimon is itself an interesting digression from where we see daimon used in earlier Greek texts for these kind of lesser divinities. And often a daimon's job is to serve as something of a messenger, the Greek word for which is an angelos, where we get the term angel. And so we're left with this odd bit where in the Greek-speaking world, especially in the world of Platonic philosophy, these daimones, these lesser divinities that exist somewhere between the high celestial gods and the mortal world, who might be running messages between them, who are currying prayers up and down, who are exerting God's influences on the earth. These entities are daimonic, but it's hard to call them demonic.
Yeah.
And so what's helpful in this is to remember how early Christian attitudes towards what they would call pagan gods insisted that they were in fact these demons, sometimes explicitly the fallen angels. And so we see a willingness to make what we will come to call a demon out of what had been a neutral entity. That's job is mostly just to kind of push fate along in the right direction, to make sure the right things are happening at the right time. And so there's a demonification of foreign gods in this setting here. But it's that background of daimon that Greek texts are engaging with. And when the New Testament is written in Greek, we're seeing some of the tension between the expected Jewish category of these evil spirits and entities, like the one we'll talk about here from Tobit in just a second, up and against these more philosophical concepts of what a daimon is.
So the daimons are getting demonified.
Yes.
And there's a transition that happens.
Yes, we see these daimons getting demonized, and we see these Hebrew background demons find boxes of daimon to fit into.
New categories.
Yeah, we're developing and changing categories. And so when I talk about like different cultures like twisting and melding and playing off each other, this is kind of the thing I have in mind here, where we have this Jewish tradition of these spirits that are antagonistic towards people who might or might not be under God's jurisdiction. But we're wrapping it up in this term that has this loaded Hellenistic lineage as well.
Yeah.
And especially when Gentile Christians are sifting out what a daimon is, they're having to navigate both of these categories. And in some ways, their answer is to kind of make a new third category to explain both.
Yeah. Make a new one. It can be ours that picks up a little bit of both.
Yes.
And we're happy to then go on our own way. What about Tobit? You mentioned Tobit. We've got to get into some of this.
We have to do Tobit. Tobit is, I think, the most interesting inflection point in how Hellenistic Jews are explaining and adapting demons to make sense of both the Greek world around them and their own lineage of intellectual tradition. I think Tobit is the text you really have to understand how demons are working in the Gospels. Now, Tobit is, for Catholic and Orthodox peoples, part of the Old Testament.
Right.
But for Protestants, not so much. Because it is part of the Deuterocanon or the Apocrypha, Tobit is not scripture for all Christians.
But it's definitely worth a read if you haven't read it before.
It's wild.
It's a great. Take some time during October and go through and read Tobit, especially if you're interested in this conversation.
Yes.
Go and read Tobit.
And just in case any viewers out there are, like me, fans of, say, Dungeons and Dragons or the Forgotten Realms setting, this is where we get the name Asmodeus, who in D&D is the king of the nine hells.
Yes.
So let's bracket that little bit of reception study for now. But the story of Tobit is a story of a family who has two problems. First, we have this virtuous Jewish gravedigger named Tobit who has gone blind because birds pooped in his eyes while he took a nap.
Of course.
And he needs to secure his well-being as well as have his blindness cured. Meanwhile, over in another city, from the same general family, there is a man named Raguel who has a daughter named Sarah. And Raguel keeps trying to marry Sarah off. But Sarah is, I'm going to very purposefully not use the word possessed here. I'm going to say afflicted with a demon who keeps killing her would-be husbands on the night of their wedding as they go to consummate the marriage. And in this kind of inciting event, both Tobit and Sarah pray to God for help, invoking this notion that we need to fix this, or at least just let me die. And God's answer is to send the angel Raphael in disguise to guide Tobit's son Tobias on a journey to the city where Raguel lives in order to secure money for Tobit that he remembered he had hidden away there. And in the process, Tobias is going to be able to solve both problems. And as he is being guided by Raphael, who's pretending to be his cousin, they happen, as they're crossing a river, to get a fish. And Raphael says, okay, take the organs of this fish and keep them. Keep the liver specifically.
Yeah.
And then they go, and wouldn't you know it, Tobias falls in love with Sarah.
How would that, what do you know?
What are the odds? But, you have to have a meet cute. So they get an arrangement. Raguel's reluctant. He knows Tobias is from the same clan, the same family as him. So this marriage is ideal. It keeps it's exactly what he should want. But he's already had to dig 7 graves.
But you've been busy digging holes in the ground.
But with the insistence and the assurance from the disguised angel, they arrange the wedding ceremony. And Raphael gives Tobias a very specific set of instructions, which is, on your wedding ceremony night, instead of sleeping together, what you're going to do is you're going to take that fish liver and you're going to burn it. And then you're going to say prayers of intercession to God. And as the text describes, as they burn the fish liver, the smell is so offensive to Asmodeus, he flees to Egypt. And Raphael, no longer in disguise, chases him, binds him, and throws him in the ocean. Now, there's a lot we can unpack.
There's a lot there.
But the couple things I want to hone in on for the purpose of understanding how this fits kind of as this bridge between the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is, number one, we got a named demon. It's not a generic entity. It's not this spirit. He's got a name. And we see a specific instance of a means of exorcism. Again, we're not seeing what we would call like a Legion style exorcism, where the possession is one where we've lost the personality. Like Sarah is not out of her mind with the demon. It seems to be a largely external force that's just kind of attached to her. This kind of like following spirit. But it is acting in very physical, direct ways, killing her husbands. One of the translations offers strangulation as the means that this is happening. And so we have this spiritual antagonist trying to prevent this Israelite woman from fulfilling her role, just actively trying to drive them to despair.
Yeah.
Looks a little Jobish. But we have an angelic intercession in which the solution is this very visceral, olfactory solution of burning a fish liver to offend the demon that drives it away.
Which feels a lot more like the other types of exorcism texts connected with Marduk rather than the verbal types of exorcism that, if you're looking towards the New Testament, Jesus, as far as we're told, isn't burning fish livers to cast demons out. It's the spoken word, which is a lot of what, if you're watching movies now, well, how do exorcisms happen? There's rites that are performed. There are words that are said, not burning of a fish liver, not these specific, not playing of the harp like David to soothe the spirit. So it definitely feels like it fits in this movement between those two. And I guess a follow-up question I have then is, in all of these different places, is the idea of demon possession normal? Is this something that is just a naturally occurring phenomenon that you shouldn't be surprised If someone is afflicted or possessed by a demon, there's natural responses. We can get rid of this, no big deal. Or is this something that is seen as this very outside of their framework, and this is a cause for concern?
That's a really good question. Actually, one that's really hard to answer because there's a range. Now, some people seem to have this perspective that possession is only the extreme cases, only the Legion, only the dead husbands of Asmodeus. But as we see, driving out unclean, evil spirits sometimes is a matter of equivalent to healing things like a paralyzed hand. In these cases, it seems like there's not so clear a line between a medical and demonic issue.
Yeah.
And we have instances, we have accounts of people undergoing multiple exorcisms over the course of their life. In the Gospels themselves, Mary Magdalene, according to Luke and Mark, underwent 7 exorcisms. We're not told specifically for what, but the notion that you might undergo an exorcism as an additional step to feeling sick. Why not get an exorcism just in case it is not just, your seasonal October cold.
Right.
It might also be that you just picked up an unclean spirit that chased you back from when
You're
you were in the corn
walking through
maze.
town, you picked up a demon who was passing around, they didn't have anything to do. A fairly normal thing that could happen.
Yeah. And
in their world.
Exactly. And I think it's really important to remember that this is a world in which these invisible spirits, these invisible agents, are part of how a natural world is understood. I've used the word supernatural periodically to try to emphasize the spiritual nature of these things, but there's no clear delineation between a physical and spiritual world here.
That's a very important point that I think often gets missed when we're looking at a Hollywood depiction of, in our context, demons and demon possession. That's drawing on a lot of times these historical ideas and frameworks that gets blended. So could you say a little bit more about how that is a necessary lens to look through in this division or lack of division?
Yeah. My go-to example here is you need to think of demons in the ancient world the way we in the modern world think about things like bacteria and viruses. They are these things that we can't see, but we know are there. And they make us sick sometimes. We can take preventative measures. I get a flu shot because I don't want to have to get the flu. But in the same way, for people for whom the things that can cause disease are not these germ theory of disease origins, but these spiritual actors, you would take other preventative measures like receiving blessings, doing certain religious rituals, maintaining religious purity. And when you are sick, rather than reaching for Dayquil or going to urgent care, you might see, can you get a quick exorcism to see if that's going to alleviate the symptoms? You need to see it as part of this broader arsenal for managing these issues. And one of the common topics that comes up with demon possession is, of course, mental health.
Yeah.
When we see the extreme cases are instances of these neurological or hormonal diseases that can cause issues. One of the extreme cases of exorcism in the Gospels looks a lot like a kid who's had epilepsy his whole life. But it's a demon being cast out that saves this person. In the same way that having the right medication can maintain and prevent seizures for people, or that having the right balance of preventative care can remove migraines, rather than looking to, say, one of the Greek magical amulets that describes the migraine demon as something rising out of the sea that invokes Artemis to stop it before it arrives. I think it's really important to remember that these are people suffering the same kinds of maladies we are, but absent germ theories of disease, absent contemporary biological comprehension, they are looking to explanations in their religious texts, in their histories, in their mythologies. And these spirits are ways they can explain what's going on. And this becomes just part of the natural world. This becomes just how things work, in the same way that if you're out fishing and you're gutting and cleaning the trout, you probably want to wash your hands because you don't know what invisible parasites you've picked up. That looks a lot like purification because you've been ritually made impure by blood.
That is, I think, a very helpful framework to look at this. A part of the issue that seems like comes up so often is you look back, if we're looking back towards these texts, it's easy to forget that they're living in the same world because it doesn't look like ours. It doesn't feel like ours. But I think that framework of germ theory demons are maybe doing one thing, this framework might be doing something very similar, is an interesting way to look back towards some of these texts to help reposition some of those things and maybe inform some of what we're seeing and some of the misconceptions that we see, especially in October, as you can't get away from possession movies of how were they playing up on some of those things, manipulating some of those things, or drawing on some of our own fears and reinterpreting that through the lens of demons or possession. And within that, I want to ask kind of some wrap-up questions here in that frame of misconceptions, because I think that touches on this well. What's the biggest misconception you'd say most people have about demons or possession or exorcism, whether it is in ancient texts or the way that it's perceived in a modern context?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception is that there's some magic silver bullet single script. Like I think of a show like Supernatural.
Yeah.
And I think like, here's people who just say the right words in Latin and the demon goes away. And neither in our ancient sources nor in modern exorcist practices do we really see this playing out. And I think there's a scholar named William Chavez who has a fascinating dissertation on specifically the portrayal and practice of exorcisms in the United States today. And I'm taking some examples from here. But what Chavez does a really good job of showing is how these practices rely on certain agents. And I think it's important to remember it's not the script. It's not just there are magic words you say and the demon goes away. Whether it's Jesus, for whom that authority comes from God the Father, who is able then to pronounce these exorcisms, banish these demons, or if it is the priest standing in for Marduk and invoking this god here. Whatever the case may be, there's always some authority, some figure who has power over these spirits who is invoked.
Yeah.
And the role of the exorcism, especially the exorcist, is to kind of become a channel, a conduit for that power and authority. And so, in popular media, it's almost always a Catholic exorcism.
It's got to be a Catholic exorcism, and it has to be in Latin.
It does. Interestingly, in one of his articles on ethnography of American exorcist priests, Chavez points out this very interesting fact that in 1999, the Catholic Church updated its specifics on when it comes to exorcism. And in these updates, which notably are coming after The Exorcist is released in the 70s and after the rise of some of these popular movies, there are additional guidelines made to require the intervention of certain medical professionals. So you need to rule out psychiatric and medical concerns before an exorcism takes place. You can't imagine a modern exorcism for the most part. I can't speak for absolutely every exorcism everywhere, but at least as the book wants it to run. You can't imagine an exorcism is a person goes and says, I think my son or daughter is possessed. The priest shows up and does an exorcism same day. It's a months-long process of interviews and medications and attempts to rule out all other cases. And then in the process of this ritual, there are a variety of pieces. There is a rite, and as you say, it's got to be in Latin. The book says it can be in English.
It just doesn't feel the same if it's the Latin. That's the language of response. That's the one that's got the power, which I do think is one of these interesting moving points of the power of speech in that possession versus the I'm going to do an action, which is an interesting point.
Yeah. And interestingly, from the priest exorcists that Shav has talked to, they would agree with you. They argue that demons respond more to the Latin rite than the English. The Latin rite has more power.
Mm.
And some of these priest exorcists, by the by, are consulting on these exorcism movies. So that way it can get that very coveted based on real events tagline to add that horror immersion for the viewers.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's an attempt at a kind of verisimilitude, not out and out pure accuracy, but close enough that it feels right.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of like gut truth rather than a intellectual truth.
That's a very interesting point. We'll have to add that link down in the description. So if people are interested in reading through this, we can put that down in the description. Should they be looking for a little bit more reading to go along with their Tobit as they're looking through some stuff in this month of October? One final question for you. Give you a moment to get on your soapbox. Your favorite nerd out detail thing you want to make sure that everyone hears before they leave for the day about demons, possession, exorcism. What's the one point that they need to make sure they have in their pocket when they're thinking about this?
Only getting one is challenging, but one topic that didn't come up today that I think is worth thinking about. We didn't mention Lilith at all, which I think is a demon people are very interested in.
I think Lilith deserves a conversation all their own.
She can certainly get one. I mean, we'd have to cover a lot. So we could go down that rabbit hole. But I think let's tie it to Lilith briefly.
Okay.
By making it about the serpent.
Yeah.
So Genesis 2 and 3, the serpent tempts humans to fall.
Mm-hmm.
Who's the serpent? Well, the text in Genesis doesn't tell us much of anything.
Right.
But it certainly looks like an antagonistic character, perhaps opposed to God's order, certainly opposed to humans.
Mm-hmm.
And so the attempt to make the serpent a demon of some variety is just a fascinating digression in these kind of history of interpretation of the scriptures. You will see people pointing out that Leviathan is also serpentine and asking if there is a link between this serpent and Leviathan. There is an interesting Jewish tradition that makes it the angel Samael, who is the angel of death and also the chief of the Satans. There is a version in which it's Lilith, who is the serpent come back to punish her once husband. And of course, if we look to Christian texts, especially Revelation, the ancient serpent, the great dragon, is of course Satan himself. Yes. And so the fact that there is so much debate about the identity of what looks just like a snake in the text, but clearly needs to be part of this longer discussion of the origin and legacy of evil in the world. The serpent is a fascinating character through which you can touch on so many other demonic and antagonistic creatures. And that's without even getting into the question of if Satan and Lucifer are the same person or not. But I think that would be the digression, the most interesting question that it's kind of at the heart of a lot of this is what is the origin of evil? And the serpent is the inroad for that question in Demons for me.
What is the origin of evil? Which brings us back to the beginning of this when we're talking about where do demons come from and that need in looking at God and some of these afflictions or maladies or discomforts and how demons start to slide into some of those cracks to maybe patch over some of these discomforts. If you have questions that we didn't get to today, questions for Peter, please make sure you leave them down in the comments, or you can send us an email. I'm happy to bother Peter again in the future, should they be so willing to come back and answer any of those questions, or get into some of these other topics like Lilith that I know could fill an hour or lots more all on their own. But Peter, thank you for walking us through some of this complicated landscape about demons today. I really appreciate your insight. I think that's a very helpful framework, especially if you're going to go watch a movie like The Exorcist leading into Halloween. Keep this in mind as you see how they are portraying some of what they are portraying. But for today, that's all we have for you. Hopefully you're feeling a little better suited to deal with any demons that you feel like you're coming across than you did an hour ago. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan Jones. Peter, thank you so much for taking the time. Make sure you can subscribe here. You can join us on Patreon if you're interested in more content like this. And we'll be back next week with another episode, so we hope to see you then. But for today, thanks for tuning in.